Let me show you a chart that shows gun homicides by country, because this is part of the context for this discussion. This is not per capita. Obviously, Japan is a smaller place, England's a smaller place, Germany's a smaller place, and Canada's a smaller place. But it's orders of magnitude different. I mean, the U.S. just has a ton more gun homicides. The majority of people who die from guns every year in America, should be noted, is from suicide. There are more gun suicides than gun homicides every year in America. And in Brazil, the U.S. is not number one in this. There are countries that have far more gun violence than we do. Look, I can't help but come to this gun conversation partly because yesterday morning when we were debating this editorial meeting, it was like, well, we don't know. Maybe the guns were illegal. Maybe he knew someone in the military that he stole it from, in which case a gun control conversation doesn't actually pertain to the facts of the case. But in this case, we know that he legally acquired these guns, that one of them was an assault rifle. It's the kind of weapon that would have been banned under the assault weapon ban. And they bought 6,000 rounds of ammunition. And even in some ways more bizarre, which doesn't even touch on the Second Amendment, I think, in the NRA, is that the tear gas canisters, which we were going on. I was saying this last night. I thought, if you think that the reason we have the Second Amendment as rooted in originalism, which is as a check on government tyranny, then there's two sides of that ledger. One is, how many guns do I have in my house? The other is, how big is the Pentagon? And the other side of that equation does not look good for those who would like to mount an insurrection against the government to check its trampling on liberty.
Historically,
there's two things. One is that studies on these very principles have declined dramatically post 1996, when the Republicans in Congress managed to squelch off all CDC funding for anything having to do with public health and guns. So there's actually a little bit of a hole in our knowledge on this. It is true that gun rates and homicides don't correlate very neatly. Having a gun in your home does correlate to the likelihood of a gun-induced death in the home. That's largely because of this huge silent killer we never talk about, which is the suicide epidemic that happens of people with guns in their homes, and that fact that suicide through gun is a far more fatal way of undertaking suicide. And most people that fail in trying to take their own life the first time do not succeed the second time around, right? So there's actually high failure rates. This is we're in the weeds of the public health on this, but I think it's important to establish. Jill.
I think that it's just absolutely unacceptable that a so-called civilized society would have assault weapons.
Right.
Why do we need assault weapons? I mean, deer hunters aren't going and shooting deer with assault weapons. And this notion that, it's the founding of the nation and that we're protecting ourselves against tyranny with guns is absurd. There's so many deaths from suicide, as you mentioned. There's so many deaths from guns in homes from accidents. Right. It's unacceptable. And I think one reason we obsess about the identities of the shooters and their backgrounds is because we want to sort of pretend that we can box this up, tie it up, and understand it, and not deal with the real issue, which is how these deaths happen. And the way they happen is people legally buy guns. Right. They don't have waiting periods. In Colorado, I think you can buy as many guns as you want. You can buy assault rifles. As you said, ammunition on the internet. It's absolutely unacceptable. And this notion that we're protecting ourselves and that this is part of our great American value. I mean, so was slavery. Right. So let's move on.
Well, I think
obviously the gun issue is going to be discussed and debated a lot in the coming weeks and months. But I guess, what do you make of this moment in terms of whether it is or is not an inflection point in the debate over gun control?
All evidence of previous mass shootings suggests that they haven't been inflection points. I mean, most Americans who die of guns in this country are from suicides. And we know, actually, as a matter of social science, that the availability of a gun makes suicide fatality far more likely. It doesn't make the impulse to do it more likely, but it makes the actual fatality more likely. I mean, there's thousands of people who die every year from that. That's a scourge that is something that is so far from the most horrific, almost cinematic details of this or the details of Columbine. And that's something that's happening not just in the inner city, that's happening in red states and western states. And even something as basic as that as a kind of like boring public safety regulation about what that means for fatalities in the country and the people that we lose to that is just so far from what the political debate has been. And basically, the way the political debates get defined, particularly in Washington and politics, is if there's a big point of contention between the two parties, then that gets covered as a debate. And the fact of the matter is, since 2000, the Democratic Party at the national level has almost wholly retreated from the issue. They don't talk about it. They don't try to move out legislation. They've decided it's not an issue. As long as both parties are essentially in agreement on that, as long as the Democratic Party decides that it's not an issue, it's very hard to put it at the center of the agenda in Washington.
I don't think the